Is there an estimate on how many students will avail themselves either of the TAP funding or the Excelsior program?
The estimate that we have in New York State for students comes from a report from 2013, and the number we have is about 8,300.
And we talked about some of the requirements. Is a clean criminal record a requirement to receive this funding?
No, just like it isn't for residents.
So somebody in the country illegally who's convicted of, say, a misdemeanor, can they receive TAP under this legislation?
The same way anyone else could.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
And how about somebody in the country illegally who commits a felony? Are they eligible for this taxpayer-funded tuition assistance?
No. We don't think so.
We're going to vote on this in a few minutes. Can you?
No,
They're not eligible?
they're not eligible.
And I read in the sponsor's memo, it says, these young people generally derive their immigration status from their parents. So generally derive. So most of them derive their immigration status from their parents? So it sounds like there's an exception in there. What's the exception?
Well, you know, when we're speaking about a group of people, we're speaking in general terms. In general terms, most of them were brought here by their parents,
Right.
or by a guardian or by a family member. So that's why we say they derive their status from their parent.
Right, but you said generally they derive their immigration status. Not all of them derive their immigration status. So who's in that other category? How did they get here?
We're talking in generalities here. We're talking about a group of children who were brought here. I can't say all of them were brought here precisely by their parents, but they did come here, maybe by a guardian or a family member.
Could they have come here? Could a 17-year-old have come here by him or herself?
I'm not going to speculate on that.
Do you think it's possible that a 17 or 18-year-old came here by himself?
Everything is possible, correct.
How about a 19-year-old?
Correct.
Is it possible that a 19-year-old adult came here, went to a New York high school for 2 years? Would he become eligible for this taxpayer-funded tuition subsidy?
If he meets all the other requirements, yes.
Okay, so he wasn't brought here by his parents, most likely. If he's 19, he's a free adult, could make his own decision, could have stayed in his own country?
We're not going to speculate on a scenario.
But it's possible,
all of
right?
that is likely
Okay. Likely?
or possible.
Which one?
Possible.
And getting back to the validating process, there's all kinds of requirements for the DREAM Fund. You have to live with your parents. What are the safeguards in place to validate that? I mean, how do you prove that you live with your parents? What's the process?
It's the same process that everyone else would have to adhere to when they're applying for tuition assistance. So you would have to give your parents income information or anything else that.
But it's a little different because in this case, we're conceding that the parents are in the country illegally, presumably to stay here. They traffic in illegal documents to make their way. So are there any safeguards in place to make sure that the person actually lives at their parents' house, for example?
So the members of the commission would be tasked with looking at every case and making those determinations if there was a situation where that wasn't clear.
So this commission could decide, we're not sure if you live with your parents, but we're going to let you in anyway. Here's your tuition check.
They would have to meet every requirement. If they cannot prove a requirement, they would not be eligible.
Right, but if I show you a piece of paper that's not legitimate, I guess I'm providing some level of proof, but it's not.
It would have to be a piece of paper that would be acceptable under every other requirement in order to get this assistance in the state.
And as far as 527 now, under this legislation, someone in the country illegally, they could...
529?
529, I'm sorry. 529, they could avail themselves of that program. Someone puts money into a 529 program and they receive a tax benefit, correct?
If they have a taxpayer ID, they would be able to do that.
Right. So do we know how much revenue is going to be lost to the state with the 529 plan, for example?
We don't know.
But we're going to vote on this soon, right?
We don't know.
Okay. How about the DREAM Fund? Do we know how much revenue is going to be lost to the state and presumably have to be made up by other New York taxpayers?
The DREAM Fund
Yes.
is made up of private donations.
Is there a tax
It's not
deduction?
state Monday.
Is there a
It's
tax
not-
deduction?
Excuse me?
Is there a tax deduction to the DREAM Fund?
The same way that any other charitable organization or nonprofit, when you make a donation, there you could access a tax
Right, so
deduction.
there's a tax deduction, someone's tax liability goes down, and presumably the rest of our tax liability goes up to make up for it, unless we're gonna cut something, which hasn't happened in my 5 years.
We don't think that it would have a noticeable impact on the state financial plan from a deduction.
Okay. And more, grad school is important to open doors. I know my father, the son of an immigrant, by the way, had a bachelor's degree and he was able to become a CPA, but that was 50 years ago. You'd have to get a master's degree now to be a CPA, for example. Many professions are like that. But about 5-6 years ago, New Yorkers who have already gotten a bachelor's degree, they're no longer eligible for TAP to seek that master's degree that might be necessary in their field. So my question is, why is the bachelor's degree for somebody in the country illegally more important than a master's degree for somebody who's an actual legal resident of New York State in the United States? Why is that the priority?
Well, I disagree with your premise. I think that the two are not mutually exclusive, right? You could support giving this benefit to the dreamers, to the students that are here, and you could support expanding it to TAP. But what we're dealing with, expanding TAP for graduates, but what we're dealing with today in this bill is expanding that benefit in TAP, in-state tuition, opportunity programs, to the students, as I said earlier, that have been in this country, that have studied in this country, that we've already invested so much in their early education.
On the bill, Mr. Speaker? Thank you very much. You know, Mr. Speaker, this debate is raging in New York State. It's raging across the country, and I did a little research. An organization called the Federation of American Immigration Reform. Their numbers are from 2011, but they crunched the number for the whole country, and they broke it down by state. And my colleagues are right when they say that those in the country illegally pay taxes. Here in New York State, these are 2011 numbers, but they're probably similar, proportional. They paid $192 million in taxes, big money. But the net burden to the state, $9.3 billion. And they broke it down. Education, $5.83 billion. So the education cost alone for those in the country illegally is 5 times greater the amount put in by those in the country illegally. Healthcare, $957 million cost to taxpayers. Justice and law enforcement, $865 million cost to taxpayers. Public assistance, $648 million per year, mind you, every year, year after year. General government services, $1.16 billion. That's your infrastructure, your roads, and things like that. And if you break it down, every household in our state, the people that we represent, that's headed by a U.S. citizen pays $1,757 every year to support those in the country illegally. And I've heard the argument that we've already invested so much in those who are here illegally. But I think that's an argument against this legislation. We've invested billions upon billions upon billions, and now they're coming back and they're asking for more. When does it end? 1 million New Yorkers have left our state in the past 7 years, much of it in upstate New York where things are economically devastated. We're 1/6 into this legislative session. Have we passed anything to help the people in New York State or here illegally? We've consented most bills. I remember one debate on propane, important stuff, but does it rise to the level of the kind of things that are going to keep New Yorkers here, end the exodus? I don't think so. But here we are, our first real piece of meaningful legislation, 1/6 of the way into the legislative session, and it's for people who are in the country illegally. What are we doing for the people who are in this country legally and have been for years? Not anything so far this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.